Thanks, Joe, and thank you all for coming. And what I'd like to do today is to present some human research that my students and I have done in our new human behavioral endocrinology lab at the University of Chicago. So this is all work done in the last 12 months, so I look forward to getting some feedback from you. And those who know me will realize that this is a bit of a change, that my interests have changed quite dramatically. I haven't abandoned monkey research. I still have projects going on in Puerto Rico, but this is the first talk I'm giving in which I'm not showing any monkey data at all. So something new. But before I start, I'd like to briefly announce that consistent with my change in interest, I'm starting a new journal called Adaptive Human Behavior and Physiology. This is one of the tentative covers that we've been discussing for the journal. The journal is published by Springer. First issue will appear in 2015. The mission of the journal will be to publish studies of human behavior and cognition from an evolutionary perspective, which also integrate information on physiological mechanisms. And those include anything from brain patterns, so imaging studies, the endocrine system, immune system, cardiovascular system. So we don't try to compete too much with evolution and human behavior, but we think that there's room for another journal which will specialize more into physiological mechanisms. There'll be 3 associate editors who will help me with this, covering 3 main areas of psychology, bioanthropology, and behavioral economics. I was lucky that a lot of excellent colleagues agreed to serve on the editorial board, including some people here at UCLA. And so I'd like to encourage all of you, first to spread the word about the new journal, and then to submit your best papers. Soon there'll be a website put up by Springer, and we'll be able to accept online submissions. So I look forward to seeing your best papers being submitted to the journal. Okay, after this brief introduction, in case there's anyone in the audience who's never heard of life history theory, let me give you a very brief introduction to basic concepts of life history. Everybody else, you can just think about something else for the next 2 minutes. Life history theory is a sort of a branch of evolutionary biology that addresses the way in which organisms allocate their time and energy to various activities that comprise their life cycles, including growth, reproductive maturation, mating, and parenting. One of the basic concepts of life history theory is that resources are limited, and therefore there are trade-offs. For example, trade-offs between survival and reproduction, or growth and reproduction, or between mating and parenting. Another basic concept is that there is an important role played by environmental variation in leading to variation in life history related traits. Adaptation to environmental variation can be genetics, such that individual differences can be genetically based, for example, in the form of genetic polymorphisms, or they could be entirely environmental and emerge and be maintained through mechanisms involving developmental plasticity, or in some cases, individual differences can result from gene-environment interactions. Aspects of the environmental variation that lead to variation in life history include resource availability, measured through caloric intake, extrinsic morbidity mortality, which includes things such as risk of diseases, violent exposure to violence or stress, and environmental predictability and unpredictability. So the theory is such that low resource availability, so low caloric intake, is thought to lead to slow life histories, which include being born with low birth weight, slow growth, delayed sexual maturation, small adult body size, and low fecundity or fertility. When nutrition is adequate, but there is high extrinsic morbidity mortality in the environment or unpredictability, this is thought to lead to fast life histories, which include rapid growth, early sexual maturation, frequent mating and reproduction, a low investment in children and in relationships. Then you can have the combination of adequate nutrition with environmental stability and predictability, and this is thought to lead to slow life histories, including high birth weight, slow and prolonged growth, delayed sexual maturation, infrequent reproduction with high parental investment. Some behavioral correlates of fast life histories include an insecure attachment, both early in life and later when romantic relationships are formed, an individualistic / exploitative social styles, high status or dominance seeking, high novelty seeking, risk-taking, exploration, aggressive and violent behavior, investment in courtship displays, particularly for males, sexual promiscuity. And in terms of personality traits, work has shown that extroversion, neuroticism, the dark triad, and all these are traits, personality traits that tend to be associated with fast life histories. Whereas some behavioral correlates of slow life histories include secure attachment, high tendencies for cooperation and altruism, a monogamous relationship orientation, so stability and investment and commitment to long-term relationships. And among personality traits, it seems that introversion, agreeableness, and the likes tend to be associated with these slow life histories. So the questions that I'd like to address today in this presentations are three main questions. First, is morningness, eveningness, also known as chronotype, a life history trait? This is something that has moderate genetic heritability, so it's obviously sensitive to the environment, but individual differences, particularly at the extremes of the distribution, have some important genetic basis. So the specific question I'm going to be asking is eveningness a fast life history trait that favors short-term mating? Second question I'd like to address is, are autistic-like and positive schizotypal personality trait two opposite extremes of a life history continuum? And specifically, I'd like to ask, do autistic-like traits, particularly in males, reflect a slow life history strategy emphasizing low mating effort, high parental investment, and long-term resource allocation, while do positive schizotypal personality traits reflect a fast life history strategy emphasizing high mating effort and good gene displays? And finally, in the third and last part of my talk, I will ask a question about the role of testosterone and cortisol in mediating the association between reproductive life history strategies and behavioral and psychological adaptations. Particularly, I will try and address how we explain the association between social sexuality, relationship status, and hormones. So it's a lot of ground I want to cover. Hopefully it will fit within a 60-minute window. So first, morningness, eveningness background. We know that there are some people who self-identify as being early morning types. They wake up early in the morning, they go to sleep early, and they have optimal cognitive performance, usually in the early morning hours, whereas those who self-identify as being late evening people or night owls, they tend to wake up late in the morning, go to sleep late, and they have optimal cognitive performance in the late evening hours. These two types are actually extremes of a continuous distribution of sleep patterns. So there are some people who do not clearly identify with either type. These patterns are generally stable over time, and as I said, there is evidence for moderate heritability. And the night owl pattern is more common in males than in females. The sex difference first appears around the time of puberty, and generally it becomes less marked or disappears completely after women reach menopause, which to some of you already should raise some interesting questions. One general question is, how do these sleep patterns evolve? We know that from comparative evidence that anthropoid primates, which include all the apes and circumpited monkeys, they all tend to be diurnal. They tend to wake up early in the morning, be most active in the morning, and then go to sleep at dusk. So I think it's a reasonable guess that the early morning pattern was probably the ancestral condition for humans. So then the question is, when, how, and why did the night owl pattern evolve? So surprisingly, evolutionary-oriented people did not spend a lot of time thinking about these issues, but a few years ago, there was a paper that put out this hypothetical scenarios as to how the night, describing how the night owl pattern might have evolved. So the idea is that during human evolution, as early humans became increasingly safer from predators due to effective cooperative defense and use of weapons, the risks of being active late in the evening and sleeping late in the morning decreased significantly. So this resulted in late evening hours providing a new niche for social and mating activities, particularly short-term mating and extra-pair mating. So the idea is that during the day, men and women devoted time to maintenance, subsistence activities, but being able to be up and active late at night maybe created an opportunity for additional social and mating activities. So the idea is that maybe men and women with genetic tendencies to be more active in the evening increase their reproductive success through short-term mating that occurred in these evening hours, and therefore the trait for being night owls spread in the population. Since eveningness-related reproductive success was presumably greater for men than women, this is a little speculative, obviously, the night owl trait might have become sexually dimorphic, which is the way it is now, and be more common in males than in females. So how can we predict, how can we test the predictions of this hypothesis, and what are these predictions? Well, one idea is that if being a night owl really evolved to favor short-term mating, it should be associated with a suite of other psychological, behavioral, and physiological adaptations that usually tend to go together and favor short-term mating. So both men and women who are night owls should show this suite of co-evolved traits. Also, there could be a possible prediction about behavior, such that men and women who are night owls should be more sexually promiscuous than men and women who are early morning. There's some evidence in support of these predictions. There are studies that show that night owls score higher on measures of extroversion, novelty seeking, Machiavellism, and exploitative narcissism than early morning types. Also, there's a couple of papers who have now reported that males who are night owls report a higher number of lifetime sexual partners than early morning men. These are papers that came out in the last couple of years. There's no measures, no data for women. So some issues that need to be addressed. First of all, there's very few studies of these traits from an evolutionary perspective. There was a study dating back to 2009 showing that night owls are more intelligent. They have higher IQ, score higher, several measures of cognitive function, and the authors of this paper had a weird idea as to why that was, and I'm not going to get into that. No studies has examined whether females who are night owls are more similar to night owl males in traits that are conducive to short-term mating than to females who are early morning types. Also, there's little or no information on the possible physiological mechanisms that link the night owl sleep pattern with short-term mating related psychological traits. So typically people who do research on this trait use a standardized questionnaire called the MEQ, standing for Morningness, Eveningness Questionnaire. There's a reduced version of this questionnaire with only 5 questions. These questions are, what time would you get up if you were entirely free to plan your day? During the first half hour after you wake up in the morning, how tired or refreshed do you feel? At what time in the evening do you feel tired, and as a result, in need of sleep? At what time of the day do you usually feel your best? And do you consider yourself to be definitely a morning type, more of a morning than an evening type, more an evening than a morning type, and definitely an evening type? Depending on how you answer all these questions, you get a numerical score, and then all these scores are pulled together, and you're classified into either 2 groups, early morning or evening type, or 3 groups with 2 extremes and a group in the middle that's neither type, or 5 groups with a clear early morning, night owl at the extremes, a moderate early morning, moderate night owl, and a group in the middle. So it's been done many different ways. The distribution of the different patterns is pretty much like this. These are our own data from a study that I'll describe later. So about 30% of individuals in a population are classified as either early morning or night owl, and 70% are pretty much in the middle. And in the night owl category, men are usually more represented than women. So we got interested in this question because we had a large database with some relative measures, data that allowed us to address some of the questions that we were interested in. So this database was obtained during a study of MBA students at the University of Chicago. What we tried to do with this database was to investigate the hypothesis that risk-taking and relationship orientation, which means being either single or in short-term relationships versus being committed to long-term relationships, whether these are associated with differences in morningness and eveningness. Also, we wanted to test the prediction that night owl females are more similar to night owl males, or to males in general, than to early morning females in risk-taking and short-term relationship orientation. We wanted to investigate whether the possible association between eveningness and risk-taking was mediated by testosterone or cortisol, and finally test whether night owl males report a higher number of lifetime sexual partners than early morning males. We had no data for women in this database. In this data set, we had two different measures of risk-taking or risk aversion. As I said, this was a database comprising MBA students, 501. They came to the lab to play a series of computerized economic games assessing their financial risk aversion. They were tested in the afternoon. Among the many different questionnaire measures that we collected, one was about the relationship status, whether they were single or in a relationship that lasted less than 3 months or 6 months, or whether they were in a long-term relationship. We also had a questionnaire that addressed self-reported risk-taking tendencies. There was a simple question asking, on a scale from 0 to 10, how willing or prepared are you to take risks in general? We collected 2 saliva samples before and after this computerized test that they took. The samples were assayed for testosterone and cortisol. The main results of this study were that financial risk aversion was lower in men than in women, which is a very well-known finding. So men are less risk averse than women. Cortisol and testosterone were higher in men than in women. Financial risk aversion and self-reported risk-taking were highly negatively correlated. So for the subsequent data analysis, we just used the measure of self-reported risk-taking. Cortisol increased after the test, both in men and women. So this test was psychologically stressful. Testosterone dropped a little bit after the test, especially in men. And average concentrations of testosterone, so the average between the pre and the post-test samples, explains some variance in financial risk aversion, especially in females. So these were the background findings that we published years ago. But then we realized that we had additional measures that had not been analyzed. And one of them was we asked these people whether they self-identified as being an early morning or a night owl type. And 170 participants, 89 males and 81 females, clearly self-identified as being either early morning or night owls. There were people who did not clearly identify this, so those were excluded from the analysis. So we just comparing people at the extremes. We also asked what was the average number of sleep hours that they had per night. We had a self-reported measure of baseline stress. And we asked males what was their total number of lifetime sexual partners they had. Let me show you some data for risk-taking in relation to sleep patterns. The graph shows that early morning females, to the left-hand side of the figure, score significantly lower than night owl females on risk-taking. And night owl females are no different from males. So there is no significant difference among these 3 groups. On the right, the night owl females and the 2 groups of males, they're all higher than the early morning females. These are data for relationship status. On the y-axis, you have the percentage of people that were single versus in long-term relationships. And as you can see, night owl females and males were more likely to be single or in a short-term relationships than early morning males and females. Testosterone levels did not differ. There was clear sex difference, but no effect of chronotype or interaction between sex and chronotype. But there is a paper published a few years ago that instead reported a significant difference in testosterone, such that males who are night owls score higher in testosterone than early morning males. The study only had data for males. So the question is still open as to whether there's a difference in testosterone. We did find instead a difference in cortisol levels. So these are baseline cortisol levels, showing that, again, early morning females have significantly lower cortisol than night owl females, and that these 3 groups are not different from one another. So night owl females are similar to males in general. And regardless of sex and chronotype, baseline cortisol turns out to be a significant predictor of risk-taking. So that there is a positive correlation. The higher the cortisol, the higher the score on risk-taking. So we did a mediation analysis to see whether cortisol specifically mediated the relationship between eveningness and risk-taking, including the moderating effect of sex. And it pretty much turns out to be like this, the picture, so that sex moderates the relation between eveningness and risk-taking, and cortisol is the mechanism, or at least one of the mechanisms mediating the relationship between eveningness and risk-taking. As for the last prediction, the one about lifetime sex partners, comparing night owl and early morning men, we had 68 night owl males and only 21 early morning males. There were no differences between them in age, sleep amount, risk-taking, testosterone, or cortisol. And on average, the night owl men reported twice as many lifetime sex partners than the early morning, but the difference was not significant. Incidentally, because we had these data and because there was some suggestion that there's also a difference in cognitive function in relation to chronotype, we looked at the GMAT scores of these individuals. So the GMAT is the admission test that people take before they enter business school. And it turns out that there was a main effect of sex, which has already been reported. Males in generally score higher than females. This is due to the way the test is designed. It emphasizes math and other things in which males usually score higher than females. But there is also a main effect of chronotype, such that both males and females who are night owls score high, have higher GMAT scores than males and females who are early morning. And there's no interaction between sex and chronotype, so just two main effects. And interestingly, there's no effect of chronotype on GPAs. So we looked at both undergraduate GPAs and graduate GPAs. There's no effect of total number of hours of sleep at night. So it's not that people who stay up late, they sleep less, they study more. So the effect is very specific only on GMAT. And there is some evidence that cortisol is also involved into this relationship. Since we had a non-standard measure of risk-taking in the study, we wanted to replicate, and we didn't find a strong effect for males, so the main effect was for females in terms of the association between chronotype and risk-taking. We did a follow-up study in which we recruited a bunch of subjects online through Qualtrics. We wanted to replicate the association between chronotype and risk-taking. Also in a non-student subject population, we realized that an MBA student population at the University of Chicago is not exactly representative of human populations. So these instead was a non-student population, and we used the DOSPERT risk-taking questionnaire. This is a well-established, standardized risk-taking questionnaire that is used by a lot of psychologists who do research on risk-taking, and I will describe it in a second. We also wanted to investigate the role of personality traits, because some of the things that we looked at, including risk-taking, they tend to be associated with different personality traits, so we also used the Big Five inventory. The subjects for this follow-up study were 172 adults, males and females, aged between 20 and 40 years. As I mentioned, we used this DOSPERT risk-taking scale. This is a questionnaire that includes 30 questions divided into 5 different subscales that correspond to different domains of risk-taking. So there is a domain of ethical risk-taking that has questions such as passing off someone else's work as your own, or having an affair with a married man or woman. Financial risk-taking, and includes questions such as betting a day's income at a high-stake poker game, or investing 10% of your annual income in a new business venture. Health safety, riding a motorcycle without helmet, sunbathing without sunscreen, recreational, bungee jumping off a tall bridge, going down a ski run that is beyond your ability. And finally, social risk-taking, speaking your mind about an unpopular issue at a meeting at work, disagreeing with an authority figure on a major issue. And the social domain risk-taking, it's a little bit different. In fact, factor analysis shows that these 4 subscales, they all cluster together very tightly, and this one doesn't really. This, my impression is that it's not really risk-taking. It's more like being self-confident, maybe a little politically incorrect, but it's not exactly as, bungee jumping off a tall bridge. In any case, so we used this questionnaire, and what we found was that there was a significant effect of chronotype. And this time, this was found for both men and female, men and women. So the night owls, regardless of sex, had higher scores of overall risk-taking, so pulling together all the 5 subscales, than people who were early morning types or people who were neither group. So we replicated and extended this finding. If you now look at the specific effects on the 5 subscales, what you find is that night owls, men and female, score higher than the other groups for ethical, financial, and health risk-taking. This is significant. Also, there's a tendency for recreational risk-taking to be higher in night owls, whereas the social risk-taking category goes exactly the other way. It's the early morning people who score high. I don't know why, but as I said, I'm not sure that that domain is truly risk-taking the same kind as the other subscales. We entered personality as a covariate in the analysis, and the relationship was still evident, even controlling for personality. Personality traits obviously were correlated with some aspects of risk-taking. Here you see a correlation matrix with the 5 subscales of risk-taking and the big five personality dimensions. And the main findings is that extroversion and openness to experience were positively correlated with risk-taking, and whereas agreeableness and consciousness are negatively correlated with risk-taking, which is something that's already been reported. But bottom line, the relation between chronotype and risk-taking occurs after controlling from personality traits, so it's not explained by personality alone. In summary, the first study showed that night owl females score higher in risk-taking and have a higher short-term relationship orientation than early morning females, and are as high as night owl males. In the first study, cortisol predicted risk-taking and seemed to mediate the relationship between sleep patterns and risk-taking. So high cortisol and risk-taking might be part of a package of adaptations for short-term mating in night owls, along with extroversion, novelty-seeking, and maybe also dark triad personality traits. It's unclear whether early morning males pursue short-term mating strategies in a way that is similar or different to night owls, so this needs to be investigated. And also we need to collect more data on sexual promiscuity and mating success in both men and women who are early morning and night owl types. Also, we need more studies to replicate these findings in non-student subject populations. So let me now shift gears a little bit and begin the second part of my talk, which addresses the role of particular personality traits, such as autistic-like and schizotypal personality traits from a life history perspective. Autistic-like personality traits are widely distributed in human populations. They include reduced social and communicative skills, narrow interests, tendency to engage in repetitive behaviors, increased attention to patterns and details. Whereas schizotypal traits are divided into positive and negative. Positive schizotypal traits include the tendency to experience unusual cognitive and perceptual phenomena, magical ideation, paranoid thoughts, whereas the negative traits include more things like social anxiety, withdrawal, and constricted affect. Both autistic-like and schizotypal traits are continuously distributed, as I said. They're normal dimensions of personality, with pathological extremes being represented on the one hand by autism spectrum disorders, including autism, Asperger's syndrome, and on the other extreme, psychotic spectrum disorders, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. Until recently, autism and schizotypy were thought to be independent aspects of psychopathology until Crespi and Babcock proposed a model in which psychosis and autism are seen as opposite diametrical expressions of a common, essentially, disorder, which is also continuously distributed in the population, which pertains specifically to the social domain. And Del Giudice and others have tried to explain this axis that includes autism and psychosis from a life history perspective. And the idea is that autistic-like personality traits in non-clinical populations might be associated with what we normally consider slow life history traits, which is commitment to long-term relationships, low sexual promiscuity, slower growth and maturation, and the likes, whereas high schizotypal, positive schizotypal traits might be associated with traits that normally favor short-term mating, such as promiscuity, novelty-seeking, and the like. So we did a study last summer in collaboration with Marco Del Giudice, who's now at the University of New Mexico, just started a faculty position there 2 weeks ago. And the aims of the study were to test whether autistic-like and positive schizotypal traits show opposite associations with measures of social sexuality, as well as to test whether autistic-like and positive schizotypal traits show opposite association with impulsivity and sensation-seeking. So we're trying to test both the Crespi-Babcock model as well as Marco's idea that these traits might be best understood from a life history perspective, where you consider also measures of mating and general attitudes about sexuality. The methods for the study included 152 subjects, males and females, between 18 and 38 years of age. We used a bunch of questionnaires, including the AQ, the Autism Spectrum Quotient. This is a questionnaire developed by Simon Baron-Cohen at Cambridge, which assesses the occurrence of autistic-like personality traits in non-clinical populations. So there is different subscales and a numerical score. I think there's 4 questions. You get, depending on the answer, you get a 1 or a 0 in each question. So your total score can range from, I guess, a 0 up to 40. And according to Baron Cohen, he chose this cutoff score of 32. If you have a cumulative score above 32, you pretty much qualify for a clinical diagnosis of autism. But this is not a diagnostic tool, okay? It's just an exploratory tool. Then there is the schizotypal personality questionnaire. Also, this has subscales. I'll describe this later. We used the multidimensional social sexual orientation inventory that looks at both short-term and long-term mating orientation, the Eysenck impulsivity questionnaire, the Zimbardo time perspective inventory, and the Big Five inventory for personality traits. What we did first was we took the AQ and the SPQ, and these are subscales. So the AQ has 5 subscales including communication, social skills, attention switching, imagination, and attention to details, whereas the schizotypal personality questionnaire has 3 main subscales or domains. One that is negative schizotypy, that mainly have issues of affect and sociality, positive schizotypy, and then a dimension of disorganization. We did a principal components analysis with all the scores and subscales and found 2 main factors. One in which we call social difficulty, in which 4 out of the 5 subscales of the AQ load positively on the score, as well as the negative schizotypy score, so the social anxiety constricted after and no close friends. The other factor instead is really an autism schizotypy axis, where the social aspect of the autistic scale are loaded negatively, and the positive schizotypy items are loaded positively. So this confirms the idea that they're really 2 extremes of a continuous axis. We also did a principal components analysis with the Eysenck impulsivity questionnaire, the Zimbardo time perspective inventory. We did find 2 factors again, one that pretty much reflects tendency for impulsivity, and the other one for sensation seeking. And finally, we looked at the social sexual inventory, and these are subscales that essentially reflect a short-term mating orientation, a long-term mating orientation, sexual partners and one-time partners. Principal components analysis produced 2 factors, one that we call unrestricted behavior, so this is about unrestricted social behavior. The other one is more about attitudes, unrestricted social attitudes. Okay, then we did a multiple regression and also looked at correlation between individual items and subscales, and also entering the Big Five personality dimensions. And the bottom line is that high autistic-like traits and low positive schizotypal traits are associated with low impulsivity, low sensation seeking, and low unrestricted social sexual behavior. Whereas low autistic-like traits and high positive schizotypy traits are associated with the opposite traits. So high impulsivity, high sensation seeking, and high unrestricted social behavior. We found positive effects on unrestricted social behavior, but no effects on unrestricted social attitudes. So we don't know why that is. In summary, there was also a sex difference such that, as expected, males score higher than females on social difficulty and on the autism questionnaire, also on unrestricted attitude, sexual behavior. But again, our results, as I mentioned, are supportive of the model, suggesting that autistic-like and schizotypal traits are opposite ends of a continuum of variation. This axis accounts for variation in impulsivity, sensation seeking, and social sexual behavior, such that high autistic traits and low schizotypal traits are associated with low impulsivity, low sensation seeking, and low unrestricted social behavior. The opposite is true. And these associations are not explained, again, by Big Five personality traits. So this was just a questionnaire study. We had no hormonal data specifically speaking to these issues. We're now doing a follow-up study on autistic-like traits. We decided to focus on males who are more highly represented into this category. We are trying to get a retrospective self-assessment of friendship history in middle childhood, as well as timing of puberty and dating and sexual history in adolescence and young adulthood. So the idea here, from a life history perspective, is that there are these tendencies either that would eventually lead to scoring high on autistic-like traits or schizotypal traits that begin long before reproductive maturation. So there's something interesting might come up from information about your friendship history in middle childhood, whether you're a popular kid with lots of friends, maybe high up on the hierarchy, or whether you like to have one best friend at a time, you don't like being in groups, or you're low in the hierarchy. So we think there's continuity before puberty, after puberty, from a social domain to a sexual domain, that there's both behavioral and physiological and growth patterns that tend to cluster together. We're also assessing hormonal responses, cortisol and testosterone responses, to the 3-year social stress test, which is a laboratory test in which the stressor is social evaluation threat. So you have to stand up in front of strangers and first do a self-presentation and then do a mental arithmetic test. And the idea is that people who score differently on these personality measure, we hypothesize that might be differentially stressed by this paradigm. And also we measure testosterone and cortisol responses to a sexually arousing visual stimulus. So we have them watch a brief video with some erotic material, nothing outrageous. But the idea, again, is that some people might find this more stressful than sexually arousing, whereas others more sexually arousing than stressful. So the idea is that we expect a different pattern of combination of testosterone and cortisol changes in these two tests, which are done with very similar procedures. Most of the work has been led by my current postdoc, Davide Ponzi. Now, moving on to the third and last part of this talk. In this series of studies, we wanted to try to understand a little bit better variation in testosterone and cortisol in relation to relationship status and social sexuality. Let me give you a little bit of background. First, we'll talk about testosterone, mostly in men, because that's where the best evidence is. The evidence is that single men generally have higher testosterone levels than men in relationships. And that married men with young children have especially low testosterone level. This has been replicated by many different studies. In part, this can be understood through the perspective of the challenge hypothesis, which is the idea that men's testosterone rises when testosterone is needed for competition with other males or for mating, and then it drops when it's not needed, for example, during parental investment because it interferes with caretaking activities. So this explains pretty well why, for example, married men with young children have low testosterone. They don't need it. But why is it that single men have higher testosterone? Well, there's different possibilities. General idea is that they need it more. They might need it for what? For male-male competition, assuming that single guys go out and fight in bars more than guys in relationships. Or maybe they need it for courtship of different potential sexual partners. Or maybe they have a higher frequency of sexual interaction. This is not clear from the existing literature. There's also another possible scenario in which the direction of causality is reversed. So the idea is possible that some men have higher testosterone to begin with because of whatever, genetic predispositions or personality traits, and then these men are more likely to be single. So testosterone is not the effect of being single, but is the cause. Or both testosterone and relationship status could be independently correlated with a third variable. So we don't know. So we did a study to try and address some of these questions. We hypothesized that testosterone might not be related to the frequency of sex in itself. So that's not the driving variable. So it's not how much sex you have that drives your testosterone. We hypothesized, based on some previous findings, that testosterone may be related to sexual promiscuity. And in single men, sexual promiscuity can include both frequent courtship with many potential sexual partners and also sexual interactions with different sexual partners. In both single and paired men, sexual promiscuity may include both fantasies and desire for sex with multiple partners. And then in paired men, this may include extra-pair courtship and actual sexual interaction, so extra-pair sexual interactions. We also hypothesized that the single men category, and to a lesser extent also the paired men category, is probably highly heterogeneous. So it's not like all single men are the same and do the same things in terms of attitudes and behavior. It probably includes both men who are highly promiscuous, who maybe are single by choice because they want to have multiple partners, and men instead who are single by choice because they don't want to be promiscuous, or by constraint because they are unable to find partners, but regardless, they are low promiscuity. So as a tool to investigate this heterogeneity of the single category, we decided to look at ethnicity. Okay, so we looked at possible ethnic differences in some of these variables because there are studies, for example, showing that on American college campuses, there's ethnic differences in sexual promiscuity. So there's a couple of studies showing that in men specifically, Asian American men tend to score lower on all measures of sexual experience, sexual promiscuity, and so on and so forth. So first we looked at our data set from the business school. So these are 325 male MBA students at the University of Chicago. The figure shows their testosterone levels in relation to whether they're single, the black bars, or in a relationship, the white bars. And these are the main ethnic groups that we consider: Caucasian, African Americans, Hispanic, Far East Asians, so these are people from China, Japan, Philippines, and people of Indian background, so India, Bangladesh. These groups include both people born in these countries and people born in the US from families of this particular ethnic origin. As you can see, among the Caucasians, the African Americans, and Hispanics, men who are single have higher testosterone than men in relationships. Among the Indian, the difference is non-existent, and the Asian men show the opposite pattern. So single men have lower testosterone than men in relationship. We thought that was interesting, a little bit weird. We're not sure what to make of this. So we replicated, we tried to replicate the finding. We collected new data with a smaller sample of male college students. This time we just looked at 4 main groups: Caucasians, African, Hispanic, and Asian, mostly Far East Asian, mostly. And again, the pattern is the same. So this replicates the finding with a totally different data set. So for Caucasians, African American, Hispanics, single men have higher testosterone. For the Asian American men, the difference is in the opposite direction. So now for this second data set, we had data on sexual promiscuity and other measures of behavior. And so we try to use these measures to make some sense of this difference. And this is what we found. So this graph shows data on number of sexual partners, lifetime sexual partners, for Asian American men and for all men of other ethnicities in the 2 categories of men who are single and men in relationships. As you can see, Asian American men in general, regardless of relationship status, have lower number of lifetime sexual partners. And also there's an interaction such that in the other ethnicity men, single guys have a higher number of sexual partners, whereas in the Asian American category, the single guys actually have a lower number of sexual partners. If we look at another measure of sexual promiscuity, the number of lifetime one-night stands, same thing. Asian men score very low compared to other men of other ethnicity. No differences in relation to relationship status. In the other ethnic groups, single guys, much higher on number of one-night stands. If you look at testosterone levels in all the non-Asians, so Caucasians, Hispanics, and African Americans, this is the relation between testosterone levels and whether you're single, in a short-term relationship, less than 6 months, long-term relationships, more than 6 months, not married, and married. So boom, testosterone highest if you're single, and then it goes down to a minimum if you're married. Number of sexual partners pretty much follows a similar pattern. Again, these are the non-Asian men, where single men and men in short-term relationships have the highest number of sexual partners, followed by men in long-term relationships and married men who report having a lower number of sexual partners. Finally, these are data on number of one-night stands. Again, in the non-Asian men, again, number of one-night stands higher in single men and short-term relationship men than in the other 2 groups combined. So sample sizes for this study were small, particularly in the Asian American group, very small, but we still compared means for their testosterone level. So these are Asian American men in 3 categories: single, short-term relationship, long-term relationship. We had no married guys in this group. For testosterone, number of sexual partners, number of one-night stands. Again, single men have the lowest testosterone, very low number of sexual partners, and also pretty low number of one-night stands. So I think this is all preliminary and limited by the small sample size, but I think the results collectively suggest that testosterone does not track variation in relationship status in itself, but variation in sexual promiscuity that is generally associated with differences in relationship status. So it's the amount of sexual activity, the kind, the variation in partners that you actually do. In general, single men have higher T, the men in relationship because they're higher in sexual promiscuity. They have a higher number of sexual partners, higher number of one-night stands. But if single men are low in promiscuity, including the Asian American men in our database, they then seem to have low testosterone as well, even lower than paired men. So these are interesting preliminary data. We decided to do a follow-up longitudinal study that has been done in collaboration with Jim Roney at Santa Barbara, in which we followed 42 men over a 30-day period, and we measured the testosterone every single day, collecting a saliva sample, and different behavioral measures were collected on every single day as well. And the preliminary results are that single men, again, have higher T than men in relationship, super strong. People keep on finding this result no matter where they look. It turns out that single men have sex less frequently than men in relationship, which is also something that other studies have reported, but with a greater number of different partners, at least within the window of the time period, than men in relationships. And this is new and interesting. Among single men, T levels are specifically correlated with and predicted by the frequency of social encounters with potential sexual partners. These are not sexual encounters. We asked these guys, did you ever chat with a member of the opposite sex who might be a potential mating partner? So these are like a random conversation with attractive women or whatever. And this predicts their testosterone levels. So it seems that it's courtship effort more than frequency of sex in itself that predicts testosterone, at least among the single guys. Finally, the last piece of this puzzle, cortisol. We decided to analyze cortisol and testosterone differently, in part because the background of this research is very different. So let me give you a little bit of this background. From a life history perspective, individual differences in baseline cortisol levels might track some aspects of the environment. For example, exposure to stress, danger in the environment, risk, stability, instability, predictability, unpredictability, and may be correlated with other behavioral physiological traits that are relevant to life history. There's also some evidence that testosterone and cortisol jointly co-regulate some life history relevant traits. For example, competitiveness, mating, parenting trade-offs. And in some cases, in order for a trait to be expressed, you need to have a particular combination of these two hormones. You have to have high testosterone and low cortisol, or the other way around. So the idea is that cortisol, from a functional perspective, is a mechanism that sort of filters the information from the environment, alters metabolism. Cortisol is a metabolic hormone, while testosterone specifically influences motivation. But there's little information about variation in cortisol in relation to relationship status. So because this study was exploratory, we just hypothesized, just as a starting point, that single individuals might have higher cortisol level than individuals in relationships. These are the same subjects for which we analyzed testosterone levels. And again, we use ethnicity as a way to look at within group variability. So these are both males and females. So this is a difference from the previous data set. It's 122 college students, 62 males, 60 females, comparing again people who are single and people in relationships. And the pattern is that among Caucasian, Hispanic, and Asians this time, single individuals, both men and women, have higher cortisol levels. Whereas among African American, this time, we find that single individuals have lower cortisol levels than individuals in relationship. Now, if we look at individuals excluding the African Americans, so the Caucasian, Hispanics, and Asian Americans, and we look at their cortisol levels in relation to relationship status, we find that cortisol is highest in the singles, and then it goes down gradually, sort of in relation to whether the relationship is short-term, long-term, married. It's mainly this group that is different from all the others. African Americans said small sample size, but the pattern, opposite direction. Single men and women have lowest cortisol level, and men in relationship and women have higher. There were no married individuals in this category. So what's going on here? So we asked these people, particularly those who were in a relationship, a lot of questions about their relationship. And one of these questions was rate how unstable your relationship is. Meaning, tension, fear of breakup, fighting, stuff like that. And these are the ethnic differences in relationship instability. So this is a relationship instability score. The African Americans are way up there. So they reported their relationship being more unstable than people in all the other groups. Whereas if you look at the other groups, this is relationship instability. The people in short-term relationships reported them to be more unstable than those in long-term relationship, than those who are married, who obviously report being more stable than all the others. So it seems that cortisol really tracks this aspect of being in a relationship. Then we also asked them, those who were in relationships, whether they thought that they were dominant or subordinate in their relationship. And we had a single item questionnaire. Do you think you're dominant? Do you think you're subordinate? In terms of decision making. And then we validated this with a 40-item questionnaire in which we asked them all kinds of questions about who makes decisions in all kinds of domains. Like when you choose to go out to dinner, who picks the restaurant, how you spend your money, when you decide to have sex, what kind of sex, blah, blah, blah. The two things are correlated. We were hoping to find something about cortisol and dominance. Nothing there, but we'll get back to that. Instead, what we found is that we asked them, one of the questions were, how much do you worry about your relationship? Okay? And here's the finding. Here we have individuals who are clearly identified as dominant. And by the way, there's high agreement on this. We tested couples, and in many cases, both members of the couple agree he's dominant or she's dominant and I'm subordinate. Okay? So there's a main effect of dominance. This is reverse coded. So being higher on the worrying score means you worry less. Okay? So dominants worry less than subordinates. And there's an effect of sex. So women who perceive themselves as being subordinate worry the most about the relationship than men who are subordinate and men and women who are both dominant. So to sum it all up, no, just to summarize this last study. Being single is generally associated with higher cortisol levels, presumably because single guys and women have a riskier, more uncertain, unpredictable, stressful lifestyle. We don't know. High baseline cortisol is generally associated with high openness to experience. There are other studies that show that. And also, our own data show that is also associated with being a night owl. We know now that being in a relationship is associated with lower cortisol unless the relationship is unstable. The more unstable the relationship, the higher the cortisol. It's still unclear, though, whether and how variation in cortisol is also associated with sexual promiscuity and how cortisol and testosterone interact in regulating emotional, cognitive, and motivational aspects of life history traits. We think that in order to really address these key issues, you have to do experiments. We hope that the experiments that we're doing, both the stress test and the sexual arousal test and the hormonal measures that we get from these tests will shed some light on the precise interactions between these hormones. In conclusion, I'd like to acknowledge all the help I've gotten from my postdoc, a couple of graduate students, and mostly this is a research that was driven by undergraduate students. I'm still in the process of recruiting new graduate students for this kind of work, and the undergrads have been great. So thank you all for listening. Dan.
So there's a lot there, Dario. So keep it all in my mind at once. But one thing that jumped out at me, looking at the chronotypes, with the exception of the heritability, and the heritability there is
moderate.
I mean, lots of things are heritable,
right.
So it's hard to know how much to make of that. It strikes me that, and again, because you presented so many results, I'm not positive that I'm accounting for all of them, but certainly most of them are conceivably consistent with an explanation in which chronotype, if you want to call it that, is something that is extremely plastic, and that people adopt a strategy based on other features. So if you're extroverted, risk-prone, and promiscuous, nighttime is an opportunity for a variety of dangerous activities. It's an opportunity for a variety of sexual encounters. The risks are probably greater for women than they are for men, so the effect should be larger for women in that regard than it is for men, which I think was consistent with your findings, right? And that if that's your lifestyle, okay, so you're out clubbing all the time or whatever, then the days that you're not clubbing, you're just used to, you know, going to bed late and getting up late. And conversely, the person who is risk averse sees, you know, nightlife as dangerous, is not interested in promiscuity, and so it isn't out trying to meet potential partners and so on. That person has mundane responsibilities that motivate them to, you know, go to bed early and get up early. Everybody has those responsibilities. It's just that they loom larger for the person who is not trading them off against other opportunities. And that, so, you know, on the days off or whatever, the person is used to going to bed early, getting up early, and so on.
Right. So as with many other aspects of these life histories, I think there's always feedback loops. So there's always bidirectional relationships between whatever biological tendency you bring to the table and the kind of feedback that you get from the environment. So aside from the estimates of heritability, there's also studies that have identified some genetic polymorphisms that account for some of the variation in chronotypes. So there seems to be alleles that if you have one of them, you're more likely to be a night owl versus an early morning person. And also, yeah, these things vary in relation to the environment. Obviously, if you have young kids, you stay up more at night and stuff like that. But overall, particularly at the extremes of the distribution, the differences are stable over time and quite large. I'm an extreme early morning type. I'm telling you, there's nothing plastic about it. I can't get up past, I can't sleep past 5:30 in the morning, even on Sundays, holidays, or anything like that. I just can't change it. Anyway, aside from that. So obviously, you might start out with a tendency, I think, and you might have tendencies for risk-taking, like you said, or particular lifestyle, which may or may not be reinforced by the environment. If they are reinforced, then you definitely go more and more in a certain trajectory, and you develop more and more certain suite of characteristics that put you on a fast or slow lifestyle. If they're not reinforced by the environment, like you said, there's probably plasticity, so biology is not destiny. So you might have a strong tendency for risk-taking and novelty seeking and being an owl, but you marry the partner of your life in high school and you're done. So keep it in mind that there could be this bidirectional relationship. I do think that it makes some sense to think that some variation in life history traits has some genetic basis, right? So there might be environments that favor more these kinds of strategies, risky strategies. So it makes sense that if individuals and the families have lived in these environments, they have some genetic predispositions already to make the most out of these environments, right? So
yeah, I guess a strong test of the competing explanation, which is also a life history explanation. It's just it's taking chronotype not as causal but as consequence, right? Would be if you and I'm trying to run through possibilities in my head and I can't actually come up with one, but one may exist. What you want is a natural experiment in which the subsistence activities involve a lot of nocturnal behavior, right? So people are normally, for some portion of the year at least, most of the community is normally up at night and sleeping in the day, right? And now the opportunities for promiscuity, for example, are reversed, right? My hypothesis would predict that you'll see a flip in the chronotype there.
maybe. But maybe if we learn more about these other traits, like cognitive function, and other traits that seem to be associated with being an early morning or a night owl, I don't know how much flexibility you can find in these traits. So if there's strong clustering of all these different things, so some of it might be environmental in nature, but other, I don't know. So these differences in cognitive function that people have been finding between early morning and people and night owls, nobody knows where they come from. It's not effort, it's not whether you tested early in the morning. The night owls score higher even if they're tested early in the morning. They score higher in cognitive function than early morning types. So, Joe.
Yeah, my question is about the model of autism and schizotypy and its relationship to life history. And I think you sort of alluded briefly to the answer, but I want to hear more about it. And that is whether this applies to both sexes, because it seems rather odd that women are less likely than men to be on the autism spectrum, and yet, in general, women pursue a slower life history than men.
Right.
So is the model apply only to men?
No, it applies to women too. And for example, what we discover from testing couples, or in that particular study, was that typically, in terms of personality traits that you see in paired individuals, is that sometimes you find couples in which both members score high on autistic traits. And that makes sense. So they're both in line with their preferences, risk preferences, lifestyles, and everything like that. And that makes their union, their partnership, stable. But in other cases, we find that men who are high in autistic traits are paired with women who are not. There's not any of these traits. And part of Marco's idea is that from women's perspective, sometimes if they're really into long-term relationship commitment, a man with high autistic traits provides a lot of reliability in terms of being loyal, committed, being a good father, no risk of infidelity and stuff like that. So men essentially who are high in autistic traits can be good partners for both a woman who's high in autistic traits and a woman who's not. Whereas the women who are high in autistic traits, it's not clear how a man who's not high on those traits would want to pair with a woman who is. There's less of a match. So that's an idea as to why there's sex difference. But there's a role for women as well.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a couple questions on the chronotype too.
Uh-huh.
The first is, so the night owls unfortunately on average sleep less, and they have more variable sleep rates across days, and both of those things are also known to be predictive of the outcomes that you have shown to be linked to chronotype.
Yes.
Have you been able to control for sleep time
Yes.
and sleep quality?
Yes, not the quality, but sleep time. In the two studies that I presented, number of sleep hours per night was not a predictor of anything. And also, other studies that found differences in lifetime number of sexual partners between men who are night owl and early morning, they control for amount of time asleep, and that doesn't explain anything. It's always chronotype. I don't know about sleep quality. We did not assess that. We simply asked them.
Sleep time is, in other studies, have been shown to risky behavior across a variety of
Yeah.
things.
I think in one study we found that there was a correlation between chronotype and sleep time, but in the other we did not find a correlation. So it was not the case that night owls slept less than the others.
The other question I have, and I guess this is more to the point of the issue you raised. So you can imagine a couple of ways in which someone is a night owl. So one of,
Right.
in the constellation of the behaviors that you talked about. So one of them is that their actual diurnal rhythm of sleep pressure and so on is just shifted lately. The other could be that the arousal activities of which they pursue or they're engaged in will mitigate against the sleep pressure. So the diurnal rhythm of sleep pressure doesn't change, but the kinds of things that happen when you're seeking stimulation either through sexual partners or by watching a movie or hanging out with friends increases dopamine, which has been suggested to sort of mitigate against some of that sleep pressure, same with cortisol and so on. So what do you think is going on here? And I imagine that separating those two would
Right.
be able to get at
I think that every one of these categories is not homogeneous. So obviously among the night owls, there are people who just like to stay out at night, even though they had total freedom over their patterns, and others who were constrained. For example, in the MBA student population, there were some guys who were night owls, and I suspect it was associated with the fact that they were married, had small kids, and studying in the evening was pretty much their only option. If you actually took those guys out, this association between risk-taking and being a night owl was even greater. So these actually contribute to a little bit of noise in the system. Those sleep patterns are clearly associated with constraints like your family status, whether you have kids or not, and stuff like that. So I think it's remarkable that even with these people in the sample, you get an effect. If you remove them, much stronger. Yes?
I'd like to see what that data looks like in a population that doesn't have access to electricity. I think this would not have occurred to me had I not lived in a place without electricity, but I always believed that I was a night owl. As soon as I moved somewhere where I didn't have electricity, no, that changed completely. And I've seen that happen to many coworkers who have gone through similar situations, and I'm curious what effect that has.
Yeah, this is work for anthropologists to do. Go out and find out. Yes.
I was wondering what the relationship between chronotype and morality judgments is, and sort of whether we know anything about that across different cultures. Whether there is the early to bed, early to rise is a moral.
Well, so there's that one study showing that being a night owl is associated with the dark triad. So people who are night owl tend to be higher in Machiavellism, psychopathy, and what's the third thing? Narcissism. So whether that translates in less moral behavior, maybe not, but not many people have looked at that.
Nothing good happens after 2 a.m.,
The moral valence would be different.
Right. I was just wondering whether, across cultures, whether there were sort of morality judgments about people who were.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I don't know.
I think,
Again, anthropologists. Yes.
I think with that question though, you have to look at, not all moral things are created equal. So helping someone cheat on their spouse is not the same as cheating on a test or stealing or, you know what I mean? Like, I think you would have to account for that not all unethical behavior is equal.
Yeah, that's not exactly what Erica was suggesting. So she was suggesting that, that there may be overarching moral valuation of a chronotype.
Right.
Not of the behavior, that is, that the chronotype.
I see. Right.
The chronotype, so.
Possible. No idea.
The Puritan ethic emphasizes the early morning chronotype. That's the moral chronotype. Not because early morning people are less likely to cheat or anything else, just because it is moral to be an early morning person.
That wasn't entirely my point though. Let me see if I can. So what I'm saying is like there may be a link. So there's a link with promiscuity and night owls. There may also be a link with like the issue of cheating, for example. Like there may be more moral okay. Like night owls may be more okay with stuff that relate to promiscuity rather than things that relate to other ethical issues. Do you know what I mean? Like, was that a little more clear?
Yeah, but again, so that's the answer that Dario gave initially, which is what are the moral principles of the different types? But that's not the question that Erica
Right.
was asking.
How they're judged by others.
Cultural
Right.
valuation
Right.
of the different patterns of behavior, not of the
Right.
types. So.
Lynn.
Actually, we should, if we discuss Stacy's question a little bit more, because, electricity, our whole life that we live now is really fairly recent. And yet you're using an evolutionary biological life history model. I mean, how do you see those two things? How do you see electricity?
Well, even without electricity, I can see how some people might have a tendency to go to sleep even before, an hour before dusk, and others to maybe stay up like a half hour later. So not necessarily, a 6 hour, 12-hour difference, but
Around the fire.
exactly. So, I see how I react to jet lag when I travel between, Europe and the States. Given my chronotype, I just want to get up earlier and earlier. So for me, coming back from Europe is a disaster because it gets me out of bed, at 1 in the morning. So it amplifies my tendency, regardless of, electricity. So clearly my biology pushes me in one direction. I don't know. One would have to do experimental tests, I guess, of this. But
I have another different question. You're talking about your chronotype, and you're measuring cortisol, but cortisol has a
Yes.
very strong daily rhythm, and I don't know how these values,
Right.
What time of day, or if the question is not really high-low, but
right.
changing.
Yeah, there's definitely that aspect. So there's a study at least that shows that two different chronotypes, the two extremes differ in the time of day at which cortisol peaks. So they have slightly different curves. In our study, all cortisol was measured early afternoon. There's still some variability, but we controlled for that. So
Not time of day, it's time of your individual person. The late night people probably have a lower damp and a different time of rise for the afternoon.
Time since waking, which
yes. Yeah, that needs to be looked at. Yeah. There's all kinds of mechanisms, so we don't know exactly how this translates into, the kinds of things that we observe. But
And do you ever consider using hair for cortisol?
hair, what's the advantage over saliva?
Well, because it gives you a really long-term average.
Oh, right.
It gets around it doesn't allow you to look at daily rhythms, but
Mhm.
it means you don't have to worry about them.
Good suggestion. Sure, we can do hair. Yeah.
So if you put your primate hat on, what do we know about chronotypes and associated behavioral characteristics among primates? Do we know anything about that?
Well, all we know is species differences, that there are diurnal species and nocturnal species.
Among a particular primate population or true?
I don't know. Nobody's looked. As far as I know.
Well, I think it's an excellent area for,
Yeah.
Because even in diurnal species, there is
Mhm.
activity at night. I mean, we see that in the capuchins on the occasions when we're near them at night. There's all kinds of all kinds of vocal stuff going on at night.
Yeah, I
Especially,
mean, we know that subordinate monkeys are never observed mate, but somehow, sometimes they produce offspring. How do they do it? Nighttime. Yeah, so definitely, we should look into that.
Yeah, I only have an N of 1, but in the society I work in the Amazon where there's no electricity, people stay up late at night partying really late. And
Everybody or just
no,
some more than
there's-
others?
Well, there's differences. There's big differences. I mean, I don't know if your results would replicate there, but there's also a macho ideology of staying, you know, the guy who can stay up late around the fire, partying, and then still get up in the morning and do their thing. So I don't know if there's night owls there or not, but there's big differences. Like some people go to bed at dusk, essentially. But there's other people who stay up really late, and there's all-night parties and things like that. So I would imagine you might get the correlations that you're finding.
Are there differences in sort of, I don't know if there's a word for it, like darkness liking, you know, in certain, because I mean, you would think that you could either, you know, stay up really late and have a high tolerance for, you know, nighttime, dark vision, I mean, not being afraid of there being things in shadows, or you could get up before dawn. And presumably you could sort of have equal amounts of darkness tolerance. I'm just curious whether, you know, anyone has looked at anything like that.
Not that I know of, but the tolerance of darkness and light is just one aspect. So the sleep preferences are one aspect. The other aspect is, for example, the timing of peak cognitive performance. I mean, people who are night owls, they just don't function that well early in the morning. Exactly. Whereas the early morning people, you know, after 5 p.m., my brain is dead. There's no way to, you know, make it function. So regardless of my preferences for light and dark, it's just the way the brain functions over the day and other things, you know.
So in those studies where, you know, to measure the chronotype, you put someone in a box and you can vary light cycles, and so light cycle has nothing to do with cognitive performance in those situations?
No, it's been controlled for, right. By the way, there's now new studies showing structural brain imaging differences among chronotypes. There's one that just came out in a journal called Neuroimage, showing that there's some areas of the brain, I can't remember where they looked, that are structurally different. There's been a bunch of functional imaging studies that show different activation of different areas in different tasks, but this was the first showing also structural difference. So we still don't know much about how the brains of these people differ.
In the third set of studies, what's the relationship between SES and ethnicity in that whole?
Right. So one of the data sets that was fairly homogeneous in terms of SES was the MBA students. Those are all fairly well-educated people, so not a lot of variation there. In others, in the other study, there were college students. Again, it's undergraduate student at the University of Chicago. There's not a lot of variation.
I would expect, you know, University of Chicago is a private institution, right? It probably hands out a lot of scholarships to
Yeah.
lower income. Obviously you would know way better than I would.
But what would you expect, or what would?
I would expect that probably African American students are going to be of lower SES status, and that Hispanics would also be.
Yeah, but see, there was never a main effect of ethnicity. There was always an interaction between ethnicity and relationship status.
Right.
So why would socioeconomic status be affecting whether you're single or in a relationship in different ways in relation to your hormones?
I guess that's true. But even, I guess I was thinking of the stuff among the MBA students as
Uh-huh.
well. You know, again, I don't know
Right.
what access to MBA programs is like. But,
Uh-huh.
you know, just because you're in an MBA program doesn't necessarily mean that you come from a higher socioeconomic status. I agree. There's not going to be a huge amount of variation, but I was curious.
No, I mean, there's plenty of research showing that socioeconomic status affects baseline cortisol levels and things of that sort.
And relationship stability and, you know.
Yeah, so if we had found main effects of ethnicity, I would have thought along those lines. But these interaction effects, you know, there's got to be more to it than that. Yes.
So for study 3 of the cortisol and the relationship stability, so you're explaining the ethnic differences by differences in relationship stability.
Mhm.
And it seems like a very straightforward way to test that would just to be looking at cortisol and how that relates to relationship stability across, collapsing across the base.
Yes, I think we did that. And
Or controlling, looking for ethnic differences once you control for relationship stability. And so if that's what's causing that difference, that should go away then.
great question. I have to go back and look at the paper because, yeah, I think we did that. I don't remember what we found. Yes.
I'm curious about the results you show in cortisol.
Uh-huh.
They were mostly related, like you put together males and females,
Mhm.
the results. Did you look at the difference between males and females in the cortical level? Is there any-
So there were, we looked at sex differences. In the MBA student population study, men had higher cortisol levels than women, but women had higher cortisol responses to stress. So they had a lower baseline, but boom, they reacted more. In the second study, instead, with the college students, there were no sex differences in cortisol levels. And the literature is mixed about sex differences in cortisol levels. Some people report gender differences, others don't. Some differences in stress reactivities, others don't. So obviously not as strong as for testosterone.
So you found that chronotypes inversely related to different types of risk-taking. In some cases, I thought that was interesting, especially since it seemed like the risks that were inversely related were kind of broken down by whether they involve discounting the future for the present benefit versus, the inverse. Discounting the present by, say, disagreeing with your boss and seeking a future status or something like that. And those seem to map on pretty cleanly to the underlying dimensions of life history strategy that might underlie chronotypes. So I just thought maybe by measuring future discounting specifically, you can kind of get at that moderation.
Yeah, great idea. Yeah, we'd like to do that. Yeah.
You got a measure of impulsivity in there somewhere, right?
No, that was in the autistic schizotypy study. The others, one was a self-report measure of risk-taking, there was a financial risk aversion measure, and there was this Dawsberg scale, which does not necessarily include impulsivity.
Could it be it's not as much just risk-taking, it's sort of reward-seeking in general? And there's utility cost
Right.
of sleeping, for example. If you constructed, I'm just speculating.
Oh, totally.
Constructed a situation in which they were seeking reward, so that's perhaps more pro-social oriented.
Absolutely.
Do you think you'd see the same kind of pattern?
Yes, and there is some work, not a lot,
Okay.
but the idea is that as a physiological neurochemical substrate for fast life histories, for example, dopamine, major candidate. So people who are into short-term sex, promiscuous sex, definitely there's studies showing either genetic differences for dopamine receptor polymorphisms, or I don't know if there's differences. Lynn is the expert on the genetic dopamine, but definitely there is evidence. Also, possible interaction between testosterone and dopamine. So you maybe discount the risk, but you also more expectation for the reward. You value rewards more. So we would love to do a little experiment manipulating dopamine in some of these guys and women.
So it raises the interesting question: is their diurnal sleep cycle changed? Is the melatonin, for example, cycle different, or is it that these other things are just overriding? So you might expect the differences in chronotype and say the melatonin cycle to be not as great as you might see in the actual sleep behaviors. That it's actually the reward seeking, the stimulation.
I see.
It's
I see.
suppressing the pressure.
Yeah, I don't know. That's
I don't know.
an interesting possibility. Yeah.
So that sort of tangentially suggested another avenue. So both in your presentation and in response to questions, you consistently report, total sleep hours doesn't matter, or we control for total sleep hours and we find chronotype. But just looking at it in opportunity costs, all else being equal, since nobody knows exactly what sleep is for, but the primary candidates right now all involve either somatic repair or memory formation and things like that. And those are both about the future, right? That all else being equal, you would expect the simplest test would just be that past life history should correlate with reduced total sleep time. Because you're, why sleep when you could be, if there's high extrinsic mortality, if a drive-by could happen tomorrow, you shouldn't be getting 8 hours, right? That is, you should be trying to maximize every opportunity now. You should steeply discount the future that has to do with memory formation and somatic maintenance and all the rest of it.
Well, there is some evidence that it's consistent with your idea. So there's anecdotal evidence that people who are highly intelligent need less sleep. I don't know if this is really supported by evidence or not. But there is also evidence, or there's been hypothesis that people who sleep less have higher sort of neuronal recovery efficiency. So basically they need less time for the brain to recover from fatigue. And that might be correlated with also higher cognitive functioning. So this has not been specifically linked to chronotype. But in this case, it would specifically involve the explanation that is lower amount of sleep. That is the key factor. So you sleep less because you don't need as much, because your brain is more efficient at recovering from fatigue. And this might be also correlated with general superior cognitive performance, maybe. And this could be an aspect of fast life history.
We should start measuring coffee consumption at faculty meetings.
There you go. Whether it correlates with how often you challenge your authority. Speak up against the chair.
It could be that your sample sleep time is a bit constrained because everyone is in an MBA program. And there are
and it's a self-report measure, so it's not super accurate.
There's also, some work suggesting a nonlinear association of performance and sleep, at least when you sort of, not necessarily experimental performance, but say school performance or other kinds of things, where there really is sort of a sweet spot, a optimum sleep, if you will, from a population's estimation standpoint. Because you can imagine you want to sleep less to do well in school. Study time is a big reduction of sleep time, at least among students.
Right.
But at the same time, risky behavior. So it's kind of, might need to treat it as a multivariate problem to separate this out about your strategy, sleep as a strategy.
Yeah, maybe somebody with a better memory than I can tell me if I am actually stealing rather than creating an idea there, because I know that Stacy Rukas has worked on sleep and life history, and she looked at firefighters who have strange sleep schedules because of their shifts. And does anybody remember whether this idea about life history and total amount of sleep time, is that Stacy's idea? Because we're on camera now. I don't want to go on record as having stolen Stacy's idea. Nobody remembers.
I do.
But I wonder if some of that might be confounded with sort of SES measures where people who have to work on third shifts are usually not like MBAs. It's usually people who are, janitors overnight or lower SES jobs. So, or people even like nurses who fit the probably crappier shifts are the ones who are lower status. So I wonder if some of that is confounded just by if you have to stay up late for the types of jobs you do, and you have to be a fast life history strategy because you're in a lower.
Yeah, again, at the very fringes of my memory, but I want to say that Stacy's idea in studying firefighters was that they were fast life history types to begin with, and that's why they were attracted to firefighting as a profession. That is, they were relatively, risk indifferent, and they were sensation seeking, and it was, sexually attractive to be a firefighter and all the rest of it, and that's what. So that basically endogenously controls for this problem.
So I was wondering how chronotype and total hours of sleep relate to the idea of flexibility in shifting around your sleep schedule. And I know that in general it's bad to have this have the shift change, and then you have drops in cognitive performance, and it's stressful on your body, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of just getting your sleep all in one chunk, or saying having the ability to nap, because I know that seems like something that varies a lot. Is you sleep 5 hours a night, and then can you take a 20-minute nap and feel great, or does that ruin your day? And I'm a napper, and I sleep for 10 minutes, and I'm great for 5 hours. But I know other people really can't do it, and I know nothing about it, but I'm just wondering whether that maps onto chronotype, or if anyone knows anything about it, or if you took different chunks of sleep throughout the day into account when considering total sleep time.
I don't know. I mean, obviously, if I continue working on this line of research, I have to start collaborating with a sleep researcher because it's a serious business. There's a lot of people. And there's a lot of research also on chronotypes dating back to the 50s and 60s, but it's all done by psychologists, and it seems to be a little atheoretical. So there's correlation with this and that, but it's hard to find any functional perspective, any evolutionary hypothesis being tested. So it's a lot of things with personality, but very little on mechanisms.
I mean, the fast life history, sort of opportunistic, and you would think that would map on to, having the ability to kind of, I don't know, grab snatches of things.
That makes sense, yeah.
Meeting opportunity, sleep, whatever.
Well, I hope that you're all going to start experiments on chronotype and napping and sex. Yes?
I was wondering if you looked at any of the more traditional life history variables like age of pubertal onset or age of anarchy, age of first childbirth, perhaps even the number of kids, anything like that might be a better way to map life history strategies onto chronotype.
Yes. In the new study that we're doing, in which we're testing subjects with a stress reactivity test and a sexual arousal test, we're also using some standard life history measure. We're using the Mini-K questionnaire developed by Figueiredo and others. And I can tell you already that they go together. So my postdoc has looked at some of the data, and there's strong association between chronotype and these life history composite measures. So it goes in the right direction. Sure.